Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be talking today with Mr. Eric Duhem, and he is the leader of the Conservative Party in the province of Quebec, the French language dominant province in Canada. And he is the fourth or the fifth Conservative leader to speak with me on my platform over the last year or so, a process that's actually been accelerating in recent months. I've spoken with a number of the candidates who are vying for the leadership of the Conservative Party in Canada at the federal level. The Conservatives, for those of you who aren't Canadian or who are Canadian but don't know, the Conservatives and the Liberals at the federal level in Canada have battled continually throughout Canadian history for the leadership position. And generally, it's the Liberals who win, although the Conservatives perhaps occupy the throne, so to speak, about a third of the time. And so the basic political landscape in Canada is center-right versus center-left. And we have a socialist party, the New Democratic Party, that also shows reasonably well federally, and they're farther left, generally speaking. And for most of Canadian history, that's been the balance at the federal level. There are additional parties playing a federal role, but they're relatively minor players now and historically. Generally in Canada, over our entire history, which is since 1867 formally, although the country in many ways goes back hundreds of years before that, all the parties have been credible players and likely to do approximately what they claim they'll do in some fundamental sense, which means they're no worse and maybe no better than generally respectable and responsible human enterprises. And that's enabled Canadians to develop and maintain a fair bit of trust in their fundamental institutions. And I would say that trust has been shaken quite profoundly in the last 5 or 6 years in a very large number of ways. One of the consequences of that is that the relationship between the political class and the media class has shifted quite dramatically. The legacy media everywhere in the world is dying a relatively painful death as network broadcasting becomes an untenable enterprise, and as the proliferation of online publishing platforms has led to the demise of the dominance of centralized print journalists, and all of that shaking out in all sorts of odd ways. One of them is that the legacy media increasingly colludes with people in power, but also, and logically following from that, no longer serves its role as proper critic of democratic leadership, let's say. And so the political class in Canada, particularly on the Conservative side, seems to be waking up to this reality, perhaps because they're treated worse by the legacy media than the other parties, more unfairly because of the left-leaning bias that characterizes the legacy media. And so one consequence of that apparently is that these leaders have been increasingly willing to talk on YouTube, and then more specifically to talk with me. And recently, Mr. Duhem reached out to me. He is the leader of the Conservative Party in Quebec and wanted to engage in a long-form discussion, which I think is a very good thing, given that it's a form of political discussion that isn't filtered through arbitrary editing or the necessary process of parsing out trenchant sound bites. And so it's actually possible to have a discussion that involves thought that also isn't a competition between the journalist, which would be me in this case, and the politician. So I'm going to give you a bit of a bio of Mr. Duhem, and I'd like to thank him for for being willing to speak with me and for having the courage to submit himself to a long-form discussion in public, because that's not nothing to do that. It's quite a daring form of self-exposure to do this without pre-preparation. And none of the questions that I'm going to ask him were agreed upon beforehand. There's no tricks here except for the ones I can't help but play. So I'll give you a little bio about Mr. Duhaime, and then I think probably what we'll do is we'll try to situate the political landscape. We'll try to describe the political landscape in Quebec and to situate that within the broader political landscape in Canada so that people who are listening have a sense of what's going on there. And we'll also attempt to describe why knowing such things, well, first of all, should be relevant to Canadians, obviously, but might also be relevant to people around the world who increasingly at their political level, especially in the West, are grappling with very similar problems. It's a very weird convergence around the world of the assemblage of problems and potential political solutions. So, Mr. Duhaime earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Montreal and a master's degree from École nationale d'administration publique. He writes for the Journal de Montreal. He's had a long career as a journalist, and the National Post, which is one of Canada's national newspapers, and works on various non-legacy journalistic endeavors online and elsewhere. He's one of the early adopters in Canada on the political horizon of the non-legacy media forms like the podcast that we're engaging in at the moment. He spent more than a decade as a political advisor in Ottawa, Canada's capital, and Quebec City, which is Quebec's capital. He advised Stockwell Day, a leader of one of Canada's conservative parties, which have now amalgamated, by the way, when he led the Canadian Alliance from 2001 to 2004 for Mario Dumont, who was leader of the Action démocratique du Québec from 2003 to 2008, and later Gilles Duceppe of the Bloc Québécois, which paradoxically and strangely is a separatist party for Quebec that operates nationally in Canada, because we have a very peculiar political system. Duhaime also co-founded the Réseau Liberté Québec, a movement aimed at a revival of conservatism and libertarianism in Quebec, because Mr. Duhaime leans on the conservative side towards the more individualistic libertarian end of the distribution. In November 2020, Duhaime ran to succeed Conservative Party of Quebec leader Adrien D. Pouliot, winning with 95% of the vote. And so I thought we'd start our discussion first by welcoming you, Mr. Duhaime, and then letting you expound for a bit on, maybe you can explain Quebec to our listeners. Let's talk about the province a bit and about